the psychology behind the most notorious murderers. It is a subject that has intrigued criminologists, psychologists, and the public for decades. The psychological drives of the country's most infamous murderers. Murder is, of course, one of the most extreme forms of human behavior, defying those most basic social norms that maintain order and peace in society. While motives for murder differ in every case, some murderers stand out due to the scale of their crimes, the cold-bloodedness of their acts, or the absolute unpredictability of their behavior. Analyzing such individuals requires deep penetration into the raising they received, their psychological disorders, and the social environments that may have influenced their acts. Early childhood and trauma. Many serial killers and other infamous murderers come from histories of abusive childhood exposures. Abuse, neglect, and exposure to violence are common vehicles for instilling a parentless life that almost always shapes the psychological, cognitive, and social development of a person in very negative ways. Physical or sexual abuse often establishes or fosters powerlessness and victimhood in victims of such violence. Not surprisingly, such children often become adults who absorb rage, feelings, and impulses to act on control. These may have made an early perception that somewhat molds one's perception of empathies, making a person not like the sufferings of other people. Some very notorious serial killers, for example Ted Bundy and Aileen Wuornos, were exposed to disastrous childhoods. The relationship of Bundy with his mother was more complicated, even to the extent where it is claimed that he was made to believe his mother was his sister when he was a young man. Such lying can cause confusion and mistrust between a child and his parents. Wuornos was abandoned by her mother and spent most of her childhood in an abusive household with her grandparents. This can have long-term implications within the emotional and psychological states of individuals. This has led some psychologists to theorize that children who have undergone trauma may dissociate from their emotions in an attempt to defend themselves. Such dissociation can become so ingrained that they are incapable of connecting with others on a fundamentally emotional level. For a few, such a lack of connection may make committing violent acts even easier, as those doing these acts will never suffer from guilt or remorse over what they have done. They can also compensate for this impotence of their childhood by wielding a heightened sense of control and power over the suffering of others. Antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy. Many notorious murderers seem to possess traits characterized by antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, and psychopathy. The clinical diagnoses of such personality disorders describe the behavior of people who have habitually disregarded the rights and feelings of others. Such individuals often engage in manipulative, deceitful, and harmful behaviors without experiencing any remorse. Violent criminal behavior has been established by many researchers as being commonly linked to psychopathy. Psychopaths come across as charming and manipulative. They hide their real motives under a cloak of normalcy and may be cleverly sophisticated in blending into society, thus generating little suspicion around them. This is very different from the kind of empathy, genuine connective emotional tie with fellow human beings that represents a person's relationship with others. This makes it much easier for them to be violent, since they don't have the moral conscience of a neurotypical. Many notorious serial killers, including Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer, have been described as psychopaths. Bundy was an extremely charming and intelligent man who easily fooled innocent people to fall into his trap. Although he was a polite and well-behaved man, he committed awful, violent acts. He could do so because he was low on empathy and did not create natural emotional bonds with human beings. Hence, he did not feel a shred of guilt killing anyone. Both camps agree that psychopathy originates with both a genetic and environmental factor. Some are of the belief that children are born predisposed to violent behavior, which is then exacerbated by environmental factors such as abuse or neglect. Others believe it is mainly through the hand of upbringing and influence of one's surroundings that psychopathy is caused, where trauma and neglect play a major role in the onset of the disorder. Narcissism and a need for power. Many genocidal murderers are also driven by a ravenous hunger for power and control. These can sometimes be bound up with narcissistic personality traits. An overinflated sense of self-importance and an intense craving for admiration and adoration. Individuals with narcissistic tendencies often have the desire to dominate people and assert their superiority, at least in part through violence. For some murderers, it is the act of killing itself that becomes a means of exercising control over their victims, thereby reducing these victims to objects controlled and manipulated. It has already graphically been seen in relation to sexual crime cases, with the act of killing finely mixed up with sexual gratification. Such killers derive a kind of satisfaction from dominating the objects of their action. Dennis Rader, known as the BTK, bind, torture, kill, killer, exemplified this desire for power and control. For nearly 20 years, he murdered 10 individuals, often taking a great deal of time to methodically bind and torture his victims before killing them. A sense of power and dominance seemed to be fulfilled by the ability to control and dictate the terms of his victims' deaths. Narcissism can even serve to seek attention and fame. Some murderers kill for the publicity that their crime will bring. They become notorious celebrities and may send clues to police or even write to the press, eager to be identified as perpetrators. The infamous Zodiac killer sent several cryptic letters and ciphers to the police and the media, enjoying notoriety through the crimes he committed. Most of the notorious murderers have been reported to be motivated by paraphilias-type sexual deviance or an abnormal desire for sexual objects or acts. Murder, in such cases, is usually bound with sexual gratification. Paraphilias can take many different forms. Some of them are necrophilia, sadism, and masochism, to name a few. These paraphilias drive individuals to extreme violent acts. For example, the necrophiliac tendencies of Jeffrey Dahmer, who had sex with the bodies of the victims just immediately after killing them, attest to this. He wanted absolute control over his victims, and since he left them lifeless and couldn't express their view to him. For Dahmer, however, the killing was more than just taking someone's life. It was even more about bringing forth the situation in which the man he killed couldn't stop him from fulfilling those deviant sexual desires. These are real and extreme sexual deviations from a deranged mind, which cannot therefore resolve normal relationships as well as sexual intercourse. Most murderers with paraphilic tendencies are afflicted with feelings of inferiority, as well as powerlessness in life generally, and the crimes committed happen to serve as an avenue for these pent-up desires. Delusions, hallucinations, and mental illness. But where there are murderers with an urge to seek the power, control, or sexual gratification that could make them the most diabolical of all, others act out of terrible mental illness. It is delusions and hallucinations that compel people to commit some of the most atrocious violence imaginable. They believe they are performing the work of a higher authority, or they do not believe their victims exist at all, but are figments of their imagination. Richard Chase, famously known as the Vampire of Sacramento, was a schizophrenic who thought that drinking his victim's blood would prevent him from decaying. Chase's mental condition led him into delusions that pushed him to kill and mutilate his victims in gruesome ways. This case presents the devastating consequences that are likely to result from an untreatable severe case of mental illness in an individual, and the dangers this poses both to the individual and to society at large. Of course, not all mentally ill individuals become violent, and it is important to distinguish those who suffer from mental disorders from those whose mental illnesses make them murderers. However, sometimes, if the psychotic disorders are left untreated, they lead to such a disconnection with reality that people commit acts of violence, which, in their conscience, seem just or necessary. Conclusion. The psychology behind infamous murderers is a complex and multifaceted one and involves the combining of genetic, environmental, and psychological factors. Childhood trauma, personality disorders, narcissism, sexual deviance, and mental illness may all serve as motives to murder. Although no single reason could adequately explain why some people become killers, knowing the interplay of these factors can help psychologists and criminologists develop a better understanding of the minds of these dangerous people. The study of such notorious murderers provides critical insights into human nature's darker side and understanding through which society can strive for more effective prevention for future tragedies. Intervention in the lives of these at-risk people may prevent some of the most heinous crimes in terms of actions through identifying the early warning signs of violence. And yet, perhaps the enigma of why some people turn to murder remains one of haunting, unanswered questions. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel.